My sister persuaded our parents to cut me out of the family, claiming I was unappreciative and unworthy, and thus, I was omitted from the will. I kept silent. 3 years later, the probate attorney called, and the look on their faces when they heard my name again was unforgettable. It began as these matters often do, quietly, with a comment made during dinner, a subtle rebuke recounted with just enough variation to keep it interesting. My sister had an uncanny talent for reshaping the truth until it fit her version of events. In her tale, she was forever the wronged one, and naturally, someone else had to be the antagonist, me. I never sought the limelight growing up. I didn't crave accolades, approval, or applause. I achieved high marks, steered clear of trouble, left home early, and paved my own path. In contrast, she reveled in attention, stirring up drama like a signature scent, quarrels with teachers, tears spilling in the hallways, storming out while blaming everyone else. Our parents always excused her behavior, saying she was overly sensitive, just caught up in a fleeting phase that, sadly, never ended. As we matured, she acquired a new art: manipulation. She would steer conversations, share only fragments of truth, and consistently cast herself as the misunderstood heroine. She'd call our parents in tears, asserting I was distant, cold, and self-absorbed, reminding them of my infrequent visits and my supposed superiority. Initially, they doubted her, but over time, suspicion took root. One day, my mother phoned and asked why I no longer cared for this family. That question wasn't truly hers. It echoed my sister's voice, spoken through my mother's lips. I realized then that I had already been judged, condemned in my absence. The last time we were all together was at my father's birthday. I had brought him a gift, an old photograph of us fishing when I was 10, restored to preserve its memory. He barely acknowledged it with a nod. Meanwhile, she presented him with some extravagant gadget he didn't need, eliciting hearty laughter from him. That night, I accidentally overheard their conversation in the kitchen, a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. "She's always there," my mom remarked. "Even when she falters, at least she's present." My dad added, "And he just watches from afar. He never really belongs to us." I left early unnoticed. A few months later, I received a call. "We've made some decisions regarding the will," my father said. "You've always managed well on your own. You don't require anything from us." I sat in silence as he continued. "We're leaving the estate to your sister. She's closer, she needs our help." I replied with only a soft, "Understandable." He paused, expecting a protest, but I had already known something they hadn't. 3 years earlier, during a conversation with my father about estate taxes and reducing liabilities, I'd offered to establish a trust for him. It was strictly a financial safeguard, a precaution should anything happen. He agreed, signed it, and tucked away a clause that neither of them remembered, since it was never intended to create drama. It was simply wise planning. Now, that clause was about to rewrite everything. In the following weeks, life blurred into a state of detached reflection as I sifted through old photos and family albums from our childhood, birthday parties, beach vacations, holiday celebrations. There I was, embracing my parents, and there she was, always the center of attention, smiling regally. Looking back, I now saw how even as children she sought to command every picture, every moment. I recalled one Christmas. As soon as I received a scholarship letter, she burst into tears over not receiving the gift she desired. I carefully returned the photos, without resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had always existed. I never mentioned the clause in the trust, not even to my closest friends, because the truth wasn't something I needed to prove to anyone. I wasn't plotting revenge or waiting to pounce, I simply yearned for peace. Yet, peace often arrives not in silence, but after a tempest. 2 weeks after my father's call, I received a text from her, a curt message saying, "No hard feelings. Hope you're well," devoid of punctuation and genuine emotion, almost like a victory lap. I didn't reply. A few days later, she posted a photo on social media, standing in the living room of my parents' house with a caption that read something like, #FamilyFirst. The living room had changed. My mother's favorite vase was missing, the curtains had been swapped, and even the couch had been replaced. Instead of honoring our legacy, she was erasing it. I closed the app, turned off my phone for the weekend, and drove upstate to the cabin I'd purchased years ago. It was a modest retreat, nestled among the trees. I lit a fire, brewed tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, sat on the porch with a book, and waited for the day when truth would reveal itself, because it always does, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with thunder. And there, that trust document lay silent in a fireproof safe, untouched since that conversation with my father, yet I knew its full significance. A 49% stake in the estate, irrevocable and unchallenged, remembered only by me. Betrayal's cruelest blow isn't the shock itself, it's the quiet aftermath. When you realize those you love have chosen to believe a falsehood because it was simpler than confronting the truth of who you truly were. My sister thrived in that quiet void, filling it with her own clamor, lavish brunches, online posts about personal healing, and videos showcasing the newly renovated family home. She basked in a triumph she never earned, and our parents allowed it. They began excluding me from family group messages until eventually, I became just a number in their contacts. I never deleted the chat. I kept reading it, watching it unfold, not out of longing, but to remember what silence felt like. They used my absence as proof of guilt, a confirmation that I never truly belong. Her favorite refrain became, "He didn't even fight for us." And that said it all. They nodded, smiled, and believed her. They never knew I had already fought, not with fists, but with foresight. 3 years prior, I'd assisted my father in setting up a tax shelter for the family property, a measure to protect us from steep estate taxes and confusing fees. He signed off on it without fanfare. There was no hidden agenda, just a single line in a document that granted me 49% ownership of the family estate in perpetuity, unless both parties agreed to change it. He never altered it, and no one else remembered, except for the paper, which became the instrument of change upon his passing. I remained silent when my sister boasted about inheriting everything, when she joked about transforming my old bedroom into a yoga studio, and when she told acquaintances that I had finally shown my true colors. Let her have her narrative. They all thought the battle was over. But victory is not a headline, it's the final clause in a contract, emerging long after the story ends, when no one is watching. That's exactly where I was. One Tuesday, a call arrived, this time not from Garrett, but from the escrow officer managing the sale. Her voice was uncertain. "There's a complication. We've encountered a restriction on the property due to a trust clause that names you." I smiled knowingly. "I'm aware," I replied. There was a brief pause before she continued. "The buyer is now threatening to withdraw. And your sister is livid." Within the hour, Garrett called. He was already poring over the documents. The clause was triggered. My 49% share could not be overridden, ignored, or bypassed. "I assume you don't want to waive it?" he asked. I took a moment before answering. I walked to the window, gazed at the trees, recalled the porch swing and the creak of the floorboards, and said, "No." That afternoon, Garrett sent an official letter to the buyer's lawyer, detailing the restriction and clarifying that no sale could be finalized without my consent. That evening, I poured myself a drink and sat on my own back deck, the cool air of early fall whispering promises. The next day, my sister called me for the first time in years. I didn't answer, instead I listened to her voicemail. "You planned this all along, didn't you? You made us think you were out, and now you're trying to ruin everything. You're punishing me for something that was never my fault." I remained silent. This wasn't about punishment, it was about preservation. A few days later, Garrett forwarded me internal messages from the buyer's legal team. One sentence stood out. "Withdraw immediately, this is a legal minefield." My sister attempted to relist the property, but agents quickly flagged it as encumbered. The news spread fast through real estate circles. Soon after, she requested a meeting to negotiate. I agreed not because I desired a conversation, but because I wanted her to read that clause out loud herself. The meeting took place in Garrett's office, a neutral ground free of drama. She arrived 10 minutes late, sporting oversized sunglasses and carrying tension like a perfume. She didn't even meet my gaze as she sat down, crossing her legs as if preparing for battle. Garrett offered coffee, but neither of us accepted. Finally, she said, "This is absurd. You've made your point. Fine, you're legally part owner. But that doesn't mean you have to make everything a contest." I allowed her to speak further. "If you want money, we can arrange something. But dragging this on is only vindictive." Garrett then slid a copy of the trust agreement across the table. "Please," I urged, "read the highlighted section." She looked down, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the paragraph. Then, her jaw set. "Any transaction involving the property, sale, refinance, or transfer of control, requires the unanimous written consent of all active trust beneficiaries." She looked up incredulously. "You wrote this?" I replied. "No, Dad did." "Did you never bother to read it?" Silence followed before she finally said, "So what now? You move in and play king of the castle?" "No," I responded calmly. "I'm not here to dwell in the past." "Then what do you want?" she snapped. I paused before replying. "I want you to remember that you're not the only one with history here. I want Mom's garden left untouched, Dad's tools preserved, Grandma's clock returned to the mantel, and for you to stop erasing the memories of those who loved this home before claiming it as your own." For the first time in years, she said nothing. Our agreement wasn't about money, it was about memory. I let her remain on paper while I kept the final say over every major decision. And now she knew I was always watching. A month later, she dismantled her YouTube channel, erased most of her old posts, and ceased referring to herself as the sole heir. Sometimes silence isn't defeat, it's a strategy. And sometimes a single line in a decades-old document is enough to force the truth to re-emerge just when it matters most. In the weeks following our meeting, the silence shifted. It wasn't the cold neglect of the past nor the smug quiet of someone convinced of victory. It became a reflective stillness. For the first time, my sister refrained from rewriting our story. She let time settle the dust, and I let her be. I neither gloated nor made an unexpected appearance. I simply lived on, acknowledging that the house was no longer mine. And that was acceptable. I had built something else, something genuine, not constructed of bricks, envy, or old photos. I had found peace. Yet, one afternoon, as I drove by the old house, I noticed that the front garden had been restored, the roses were back, my mother's wind chimes returned to the porch, and Grandma's clock was once again visible in the front window on the mantel. I smiled, knowing she had finally understood. Later that week, a small package arrived without a note or return address. Inside, I found a folded photograph of me with my parents at the beach, one I hadn't seen in years, and beneath it, the final letter my mother had written. I had thought it lost. I spent a long time at my kitchen table, gazing at it, no tears, just a deep sense of gratitude. Sometimes, the most powerful act is simply to remain still while the world spins wildly around you. They had tried to erase me, but the paper remembered, and so did I. I never needed the house, just the truth. That spring, I planted roses in my own garden, the same soft, pale pink blooms my mother used to nurture. They took root quickly, as if they knew they belonged. I brewed tea in the mornings, revisited books long neglected, and took lengthy walks without checking my phone. The world owed me nothing, and for the first time in ages, I felt unburdened by obligation. At the local farmer's market one day, I encountered my sister. She was alone, carrying a basket of lemons and herbs. We exchanged a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement that said more than any conversation could. That was all we needed. I began writing a book, not about her, not about the house, but about memory, how we carry family with us not through tangible inheritances, but via rituals, recipes, letters, and quiet mornings. The dedication was simple, to those who tried to forget me and to those who never did. In August, Garrett invited me to dinner. He brought a bottle of wine and chuckled when I asked if he was celebrating something. "Just closure," he said. We discussed everything and nothing until the subject of the house resurfaced. "She never contested it again?" I asked. No, he replied. I believe once she realized you weren't trying to seize it, only safeguard it, she stopped fighting ghosts. That night, I sat outside long after Garrett had left. The moon hung low, and the sky shimmered with stars as I thought of my parents, our past missteps, the spoken and unspoken. I felt not bitterness but fullness. I framed that beach photo and hung it in my hallway, and next to it, I placed my mother's handwritten letter that read, "You'll always be part of this family. Even when others forget, I won't." Some inherit houses, but others inherit resilience. I had both, and that was more than enough. A few weeks after Mom's passing, my sister decided to sell the house. She listed it quietly, off the public radar. Initially, she thought she could manage a swift, discreet sale, but once the paperwork hit the transaction desk, Garrett received the alert. "She's already signed a tentative agreement with a buyer," he told me. "Let her," I replied. He laughed. "You're so cold," I answered. "I'm patient, and now it's my turn." They believed they had won, but victory isn't found in headlines. It's in that final clause of a contract, in the moments after everyone else has stopped watching. The call came on a Tuesday, not from Garrett this time, but from the escrow officer handling the sale. "We've encountered a complication," she said. "A trust clause restricts the property. It names you." I smiled knowingly. The buyer's lawyer soon received Garrett's email, which confirmed the restriction and explained that a clean sale was impossible without my consent. That night, I poured myself a drink on my back deck as the cool, crisp air of fall whispered promises of change. Then, my sister called for the first time in years. I didn't answer. Instead, I listened to her voicemail. "You planned this all along, didn't you? You made us all think you were out, and now you're trying to ruin everything. You're punishing me for something that was never my fault." I stayed silent. It wasn't about punishment, it was about preservation. A few days later, Garrett forwarded internal messages from the buyer's legal team. One line struck me. "Withdraw immediately, this is a legal minefield." My sister tried to relist the property, but soon real estate agents flagged it as encumbered. Word spread quickly. Not long after, she requested a meeting to negotiate. I agreed, not because I wanted to talk, but so that she could read that crucial line aloud for herself. The meeting was set in Garrett's office, a neutral ground free of theatrics. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing oversized sunglasses and exuding tension like a heavy scent. She didn't acknowledge me as she slid into her chair and crossed her legs, as if preparing for combat. Garrett offered coffee, but neither of us accepted. Finally, she began. "This is ridiculous. You've made your point, fine, you're legally a co-owner. But that doesn't mean you have to complicate everything." I let her speak. "If you want money, we can negotiate. But dragging this out is merely spiteful." Garrett quietly pushed a copy of the trust agreement toward her. "Please," I urged, "read the highlighted section." She glanced down, irritation flashing across her eyes as she scanned the paragraph. Then she stopped, reread it, and her expression hardened. "Any transaction involving the property, sale, refinance, or transfer of controlling interest, requires the unanimous written consent of all active trust beneficiaries." She looked up. "You wrote this?" I answered. "No, Dad did." "Did you ever read it?" A long silence ensued before she finally said, "So what now? You move in and assume control?" "No," I replied. "I'm not here to dwell in what once was." "Then what do you want?" she snapped. I paused before answering. "I want you to remember that you're not the only one with history here. I want Mom's garden to remain untouched, Dad's tools preserved, Grandma's clock returned to its rightful place, and for you to stop erasing the legacy of those who loved this home long before it became yours." For the first time in years, she said nothing. Our arrangement wasn't about money, it was about preserving memory. I allowed her to remain on paper, while I kept veto power over every major decision. And now she knew I was always watching. In the weeks after that meeting, the silence transformed. It wasn't the cold absence of the past nor the smug quiet of a supposed victor. it became almost reflective. For once, my sister didn't try to rewrite our story. She let the dust settle, and I let her be. I didn't gloat, didn't show up unannounced, and didn't post updates. I simply lived, accepting that the house was no longer mine to inhabit. And that was okay. I had built something else, something authentic, not built on bricks, jealousy, or old photographs. I had found peace. Yet one day, as I drove by the old house, I saw that the front garden had been revived. The roses were blooming again, my mother's cherished wind chimes had returned to the porch, and Grandma's clock was visible once more on the mantel. I smiled softly. Later that week, I received a small box in the mail with no note or return address. Inside was a photograph of me with my parents at the beach, a picture I hadn't seen in years, folded carefully, with my mother's last letter beneath it. I had believed it lost. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, simply staring at it, not shedding tears, just filled with gratitude. Sometimes the most profound act is to stand still as the world spins wildly around you. They tried to write me out, but the paper remembered, and so did I. I never needed the house, only the truth. That spring, I planted roses in my own garden, the same gentle, pale pink blooms that Mom used to nurture. They flourished quickly, as if they knew they belonged. I made tea in the mornings, revisited long-neglected books, and took walks without checking my phone. The world owed me nothing, and for the first time in years, I felt unburdened. One day, I saw my sister at the farmer's market, alone, carrying a basket of lemons and herbs. We exchanged a nod, no wave, no smile, just a silent acknowledgement that said everything. And that was enough. I began drafting a book, not about her or the house, but about memory, about how we carry our families not through possessions, but through traditions, recipes, letters, and quiet mornings. The dedication was simple, to those who tried to erase me and to those who never did. In August, Garrett invited me to dinner. He brought a bottle of wine and laughed when I asked if there was a celebration. Just closure, he said. We talked about everything and nothing until inevitably, the topic of the house arose. She never contested it again? I asked. No, he replied. I think once she realized you weren't trying to take it over, only to protect it, she stopped battling the past. That night, I lingered outside long after Garrett left. The moon was low, and the sky was heavy with stars as I thought of my parents, our mistakes, the words spoken and unsaid. I felt neither bitterness nor regret, only fulfillment. I framed the beach photo and hung it in my hallway, right beside the letter penned by my mother, which read, "You'll always be a part of this family. Even when others forget, I won't." Some people inherit houses, others inherit resilience. I received both, and that was more than enough. The call came on a Tuesday, this time not from Garrett, but from the escrow officer. "There's an issue," she said, "Trust clause restricts the property, and it names you." I smiled. Soon, Garrett sent the buyer's lawyer an official letter detailing the restriction, making it clear that no sale could go through without my approval. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat on my back deck as cool fall air set in. A few days later, my sister called for the first time in years. I didn't answer. Instead, I listened to her voicemail. "You planned this all along, didn't you? You made us believe you were out, and now you're trying to ruin everything. You're punishing me for something that was never my fault." I said nothing. It wasn't about punishment, it was about safeguarding our legacy. A few days later, Garrett forwarded me a snippet of the buyer's legal team's internal conversation. One line stood out. "Withdraw immediately, this is a legal minefield." My sister attempted to relist the property, but soon real estate agents marked it as encumbered. Word of the restrictions spread quickly. Then came a request for a meeting to negotiate. I agreed, not out of a desire to converse, but so that she could read that critical clause aloud herself. The meeting was held in Garrett's office, neutral ground with no room for theatrics. She arrived 10 minutes late, sporting oversized sunglasses and exuding tension like a heavy cologne. She sat without meeting my eyes, crossing her legs as if bracing for battle. Garrett offered coffee, but we both declined. Finally, she said, "This is absurd. You've made your point. Fine, you're legally a co-owner. But you don't have to complicate every step." I allowed her to speak further. "If you want cash, we can figure something out. But dragging this on is nothing but spite." Garrett then slid a copy of the trust agreement across the table. "Please," I urged, "read the highlighted section." She looked down with irritation as she scanned the paragraph. Then she paused, reread it, and her expression hardened. "Any transaction involving the property, sale, refinance, or transfer of control, requires the unanimous written consent of all active trust beneficiaries." She looked up. "You wrote this?" I replied. "No, Dad did." "Didn't you ever read it?" After a long silence, she finally said, "So what now? Do you move in and rule like a king?" "No," I answered calmly. "I'm not here to dwell on what once was." "Then what do you want?" she snapped. I paused before replying. "I want you to remember that you're not the only one with history here. I want Mom's garden to remain untouched, Dad's tools preserved, Grandma's clock restored to its place, and for you to stop erasing the memories of those who cherished this home before it became yours." For the first time in years, she said nothing. Our deal wasn't about money, it was about preserving memory. I let her stay on paper, while I held full veto power over every major decision. And now she knew I was always vigilant. In the weeks following our meeting, the silence took on a new quality. It wasn't the cold distance of before nor the smug quiet of a presumed victor, it became reflective. For once, my sister refrained from rewriting our story, she let the dust settle, and I let her be. I didn't gloat, didn't drop by unannounced, didn't post updates. I simply continued living, acknowledging that the house was no longer mine. And that was perfectly fine. I had created something else, something authentic, not built from bricks, envy, or old photographs. I had found peace. One afternoon, as I drove past the old house, I noticed the front garden had been restored, the roses were blooming once again, my mother's cherished wind chimes had returned to the porch, and Grandma's clock was once more visible on the mantel. I smiled, understanding that she had finally grasped the message. Later that week, I received a small package in the mail, no note, no return address. Inside was a photo of me with my parents at the beach, a snapshot I hadn't seen in years, carefully folded, with the last letter my mother had ever written tucked beneath it. I had believed it lost. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, just staring at it, not crying, only feeling deep gratitude. Sometimes the most powerful act is simply to stand still while the world whirls around you. They attempted to write me out, but the paper remembered, and so did I. I never needed the house, just the truth. That spring, I planted roses in my own garden, the same delicate, pale pink blooms that Mom used to nurture. They flourished quickly, as though they knew they were home. I made tea every morning, revisited books I'd long meant to finish, and took long walks without checking my phone. The world owed me nothing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened by obligation. When I saw my sister at the farmer's market one day, she was alone, carrying a basket filled with lemons and herbs. We exchanged a simple nod, not a wave, not a smile, just a quiet acknowledgement that said everything we needed. And that was enough. I started working on a book, not about her, not about the house, but about memory, about how we carry our family within us not through physical inheritances but through traditions, recipes, letters, and quiet mornings. The dedication was plain, to those who tried to forget me and to those who never did. In August, Garrett invited me to dinner. He brought a bottle of wine and chuckled when I asked if there was something to celebrate. "Just closure," he replied. We discussed everything and nothing until inevitably, the topic of the house resurfaced. "She never contested it again?" I asked. "No," he said. "I believe once she realized you weren't trying to seize it, only to protect it, she ceased fighting the past." That night, I sat outside long after Garrett had left, the moon low and the sky heavy with stars, contemplating my parents, our mistakes, the spoken and unspoken words. I felt not anger but completeness, I framed that beach photo and hung it in my hallway, and right beside it, I placed a letter written in my mother's soft, flowing script. You'll always be part of this family. Even when others forget, I won't. Some inherit houses, while others inherit resilience. I got both, and that was more than enough.